Hi, everyone. We're just going to give people another minute or two, and then we will get started. All right, I'm going to get started. We'll keep letting people in as they join. Looks like there's a couple more people filtering into the room too. So welcome everyone to another quarter of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We meet every Monday at this time in this place, but also in the virtual space. So as you'll see, some of our talks this quarter are going to be here in person, and some of them will be online. And there's a Zoom option for all of them. So if you can't make it here, you can always Zoom in. I want to start just by thanking our sponsors. So our main sponsor for Beck is the Dean of Social Sciences, but we also are helped out by the Department of Anthropology and the Department of Communication. And we also have several generous private donors who help to fund Beck also. The list of all the talks that are coming up for the rest of the quarter are at our website at beck.ucla.edu. We have kind of a shift happening where the first few talks are online, and then we shift, and the second half of the talks are, I think, almost all in person. So around beginning of February, I think, is when we make the switch to being back in person for most of those talks. Next week, Amanda Leah is coming, and again, that will be on Zoom. The title of her talk is Lifestyle Change and Health in the Turkana of Northwest Kenya. The following week is MLK, so we won't have a Beck talk that week because we are on break. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Marina Davila-Ross, who is here virtually from the University of Portsmouth, is going to be talking to us today, a talk entitled Laughter and Smiles Toward Understanding the Complexity and Phylogenetic Continuity of Positive Communication in Hominids. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about my research on laughter and smiles. Yes, so yeah, let me start off then with introducing laughter and smiles in humans. We all know what it is, that it's a very positive expressions primarily. A baby can produce a smile while sleeping. It's laughter and smiles clearly play an important role in social play in children, helping them to develop all sorts of important skills, cognitive, emotional, social skills. And laughter occurs as a pervasive tool in human social communication. It's an expression that can be spontaneously produced, and it can be an expression that can be more polite as a response. Exchanges of laughter and exchanges of smiles are very important for social cohesion. And it can also mean something else. It's not only positive, it can be something going more in the direction of mocking laughter or Schadenfreude laughter. And I would argue that they exist to some extent due to a positive core. But if we look at laughter and smiles as a positive expression, perhaps we can find that I argue that perhaps we can see more of that from an evolutionary perspective in non-human primates, perhaps. So how did these expressions evolve? These very important complex expressions that we see in human everyday social interactions. And for that, it's important to note it occurs very early in human development. Smiles occur earlier than laughter, which occurs after a few months. It's also humans also produce laughter and smiles without having any experience in producing them. For instance, congenitally deaf people are producing laughter of the same acoustic qualities. And it's a cross-cultural phenomenon. It can also be perceived as something positive across different cultures. And it's deeply rooted in our biological systems. It's part of our, or it's linked to our dopaminergic reward system, and can be genetically, at least partly, be explained. So all of this is suggesting that it would make lots of sense to examine these expressions in our closest evolutionary relatives, the great apes. That has been much of interest in my research, and I looked at expressions of play particularly. Obviously, there's the link with positive emotions, but not only that, there are important similarities also with regard to the anatomy of the vocalizations and the facial expressions. So great apes, and one could argue also other non-human primates, produce vocalizations and open mouth faces in their social play, in their solitary play, and when they're being tickled. And already researchers going back to Darwin have pointed out that there are these interesting similarities in anatomy as well as context. And they also occur early in development. Here you see a video of, you're going to see a video of Yuma, a 5-month-old chimpanzee from Arnhem Zoo, who was interacting with the zookeeper as part of this video. And she's showing these wide open mouth expressions. This is a mute video, by the way. So these expressions already look quite similar to the open mouth expressions of play in juveniles and adolescents and adults among the apes. It is also these vocalizations and open mouth faces of play are also occurring across populations. For instance, different chimpanzee populations, they frequently can be heard and seen in various chimpanzee populations. Here's a video showing Victoria, an adult female with her newborn, and she's playfully interacting with this newborn, and he's producing these vocalizations of play. That video was taken in Chimfunji in Zambia, a sanctuary in Zambia. And then these vocalizations and facial expressions can also occur across taxa. Here you see a gorilla, a subadult gorilla, presenting his foot to be tickled and producing such vocalizations. And also one can see these open mouth faces while being tickled by a zookeeper in Berlin Zoo. Oops, sorry. So there are interesting similarities regarding these vocalizations and facial expressions of great apes when we think about human laughter and human smiles. And clearly, it's an important question whether there's common ancestry here regarding these expressions of humans, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. Or is it perhaps the case that they have a different origins, or maybe some of them have a different origins and some of them have common ancestry? So this is an important question, of course, to answer when we think about laughter playing such an important role in humans. In order to phylogenetically assess it, of course, it's important to look at the principle of maximum parsimony. When phylogenists, when geneticists examine this, they're considering more the least number of predicted evolutionary changes in the reconstructed phylograms that they obtain from their genetically based data. But since we are looking here at behaviors, we have to also see whether one can use behavioral data in a similar way. And that has been done before, particularly with acoustic data. And a number of bird studies, primarily bird studies, have used acoustic data for phylogenetic reconstructions. Also, the research by Thomas Geismann has used such data for phylogenetic reconstructions of gibbon songs. So acoustic data can be quite insightful regarding understanding better evolutionary relationships. But for the great apes and humans, we already know how they relate to one another. It's a well-established phylogenetic tree regarding these taxa. So what we considered then was to use acoustic data, similar to how researchers have, like Thomas Geismann, have done before, and test whether the resulting trees based on acoustics, which match the phylogenetic tree that has been so well established by geneticists on humans and great apes. So this is a study that was carried out as part of my PhD several years ago already, in collaboration with Michael Oren, who worked then at Georgia State University, and Elke Zimmermann, who worked then at the University of Hanover in Germany. And we asked zookeepers and sanctuary keepers if they could tickle apes, and we were able to obtain acoustic recordings, tickle-induced vocalizations from 5 ape species, including the great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and bonobos, and a lesser ape, siamangs, who served then as an outgroup. And we also asked mothers, human mothers, if they could tickle their babies. And then we obtained the acoustic data, the acoustic recordings, and conducted very systematic acoustic analysis. Here you see 3 sonograms regarding these tickle-induced vocalizations. The first one of a human infant. Second one of a chimpanzee. And the third one of an orangutan. So there are commonalities here as well as differences, both important for the phylogenetic reconstructions. We use data from infants and juveniles, young juveniles, for this study. We then conducted the acoustic analysis and used the acoustic data for phylogenetic analysis, and the resulting tree was a maximum parsimony tree with using exhaustive search, and it showed a tree topology that resembled that of a genetically based tree with humans at one end and the lesser apes at the other end. and bonobos and chimpanzees closest to humans equidistantly, then gorillas, and then orangutans following the gorillas. So since we used human laughter in the study, tickle-induced laughter, we could make the conclusion that these vocalizations, all of these vocalizations that were included in this study were laugh vocalizations, and that laughter emerged from pre-existing traits at least 10 to 16 million years old. And the term laughter is not anthropomorphic in our view as a result of this phylogenetic reconstruction. So what was interesting then was to map the acoustics on that phylogenetic tree and to see how laughter changed in its acoustic form over time. I'm not going to go much in detail regarding this, but I wanted to point out that one of the important traits regarding laughter regarding the evolution of laughter closer towards humans was that laughter became more and more voiced, and which is responsible for the melodic sound of laughter, like this ha-ha, he sound, in comparison to the breathy vocalizations of the great apes that you just heard. We were also able to determine when the emergence was of specific acoustic properties. We were able to reconstruct how most likely the last common ancestor of the apes must have sounded like. These were most likely short call series with slow calls, more noisy, less complex, and they were similar actually to human laughter, produced more as an egressive sound, so more during exhalations produced. We noticed that there was a lot of exaggeration in the acoustic traits, moving to one direction throughout great ape and human or hominin evolution. And we also noticed that there were reversals of traits, that evolution does not only go in one direction. So then after that, we looked at the relationship between laugh vocalizations and the facial expressions accompanying them. So we argued that these great ape laugh vocalizations most likely evolved gradually to humans. They were produced in the same context, in the context of play, and they were accompanied often, almost always, by open mouth faces. So there are similarities here with the way human laughter is produced. When we look at the facial expressions, we see that the open mouth faces of the great apes show some interesting resemblances with human laugh facing. When I use the term laugh face, I mean the facial expressions that accompany laughter. And they are produced also in playful contexts, and they can be just like smiles, produced with laughter and without laughter. So it's a unimodal and multimodal expression. So this made us wonder how these expressions, or how human smiles, evolved, and to what extent they may be linked to open mouth faces of great apes. So it was important to revisit older models on the evolution of smiles, and particularly important it was to look at the emancipation hypothesis of Van Hoof that was developed about 50 years ago. So Van Hoof argued that human smiles emerged from submissive expressions. I'm sure you've heard about these negative expressions of apes that then became positive expressions in humans. But it's important to look at why he reasoned in that way. He actually was interested in the open mouth phase of play, but argued that the upper teeth were not visible in the apes that he observed in Burger Zoo in Arnhem, at least in that colony at that time. And the upper teeth exposure is very important for human laughter. So then he looked at another facial expression in chimpanzees, namely the silent bared teeth displays, which show these upper teeth. You see here also some pictures. So one type of the silent bared teeth expressions is showing a wide open mouth, similar to the open mouth phases of play, and also exposing the upper teeth. So therefore, he argued that these expressions that are often seen in submissive contexts were precursors of human smiles. But one now needs to look at what research on ape play is showing. Namely, there are a number of studies, and not only about apes, there are also studies on other non-human primates such as macaques. These studies are showing that every now and then these primates are exposing their upper teeth. So therefore, it was really important to examine this more closely and in relation to the evolution of smiles, in order to see which of these expressions may be the precursors of human smiles. So in a study conducted in collaboration with Kim Bard from Portsmouth University, we examined the open mouth faces of chimpanzees more closely, and also following here the principle of maximum parsimony. We used chimfax, which was leaning on the facial action coding system developed by Paul Ekman and colleagues. And chimfax allowed us to examine the muscle activations of chimpanzees and directly compare them with the muscle activations of humans, which was ideal for our purposes. And we applied chimfax, which is a coding system that we can use non-invasively, just using videos. We applied chimfax to measure the open mouth faces accompanied by laughter and those without laughter. Studied those in 3 semi-wild chimpanzee colonies in Zambia at Chimfunji Wildlife Sanctuary. And we found that most of these expressions or most of the variants that we found regarding these open mouth expressions were present both multimodally and unimodally. And we also found that they showed a similar pattern of occurrence. Those facial constellations that were most frequently present for the multimodal expressions, they were also most frequently present for the unimodal expressions. So a similar pattern here, and therefore we concluded that the open mouth faces that were silently produced were the same expressions as the multimodal, as the open mouth faces that were accompanied by laughter. So that was the first step. The next step was to look more closely at these expressions in relation to humans. And we found that the core action units of human laughter were present in of human laugh faces were present in the chimpanzees while they were laughing, including the upper lip raiser, the AU10, the action unit 10, which Van Hoof pointed out didn't exist in the chimpanzees from Arnhem. And so therefore, we were arguing that these expressions, based on the principle of maximum parsimony, are shared across humans and chimpanzees. And we also noticed something similar for orangutans. We developed in collaboration with Bridget Waller from Portsmouth, who was then at Portsmouth University, now in Nottingham Trent. We developed orang facts for orangutans, very same approach as was developed previously for chimp facts. And we studied these orangutans during play and found the same action units present in play as we found in the laughing chimpanzees, including the AU10, which is responsible for the upper teeth exposure. So that we therefore concluded that laugh faces of humans and positive smiles most likely evolved from these positive expressions of ancestral great apes, and these expressions did not evolve from submissive ones or negative ones of these apes. And I think nowadays it's really interesting to look at this beyond the apes. We see very similar expressions in other primates as well as in carnivores. There is a facial complexity that we see beyond primates. There is research done by Elisabetta-Palagi, for instance, on dogs and other carnivores. And we also found sun bears to produce these complex facial expressions that show a lot of interesting resemblances with the human laugh faces. But of course, one cannot just note that there's an upper teeth exposure and therefore we can conclude for shared ancestry. It's important, of course, to look at this more specifically. So in a study conducted together with Elisabetta-Palagi, we looked at 3 caniform species and 3 filiform species using dog facts and cat facts and coding 110 open mouth faces. And we found that the action units that are so relevant for human laugh faces are also present in also made use of in these different species, in wolf dogs, sun bears, wild dogs, hyenas, meerkats, and lions. There is less the evidence is less strong for the lower lip depressor, but even for that one, we have found it to be present in 3 of the studied species. So this is suggesting that these laugh faces that we are showing have much deeper evolutionary roots. And I think that is quite interesting to consider, particularly in relation to a paper written by Sasha Winkler and Greg Bryant on where play vocalizations were reviewed and the potential of carnivore laughter was discussed. So I think this is very interesting to look at from a phylogenetic perspective regarding phylogenetic reconstructions as well. So I think it's interesting that research is going more and more in this direction where other species are being included. Yes, so I also wanted to point out briefly that there are some traits that are more present in humans. I did not mention the AU6 before, the cheek razor, which is responsible for crow's feet. This is less rare in apes. It's present though. It's something that's responsible. Well, it's the core trait that is responsible for the Duchenne smile in humans, and it's perceived as more positive by others. And also there's voicing that is rare in apes. And interestingly, it is perceived as more positive by others, as research by Joan Bakarowski and Michael Orwin have shown. So these are sounds from Joan Bakarowski's lab. First of all, the voiced laughter. And this is how laughter sounds when it's not voiced, and we produce most of the time such laughter. So it's really interesting that these acoustic traits and facial traits that make up human laughter and smiles that are so important for human laughter and smiles, that they are more present in humans and they are perceived as more positive. Perhaps this explains why, perhaps it explains how important laughter is in and smiles are in humans. It's perhaps such a highly relevant social behavior, or it is definitely such a very relevant social behavior in humans, perhaps more relevant than in great apes. And most likely there were gradual evolutionary changes towards these expressions to be perceived as more positive. That doesn't mean that that there is more joy involved necessarily, but they are just perceived as more positive. So there were gradual evolutionary changes in form and function, probably over the last 10 to 16 million years. And it's important to look at complexity of these expressions. Clearly, there are highly complex expressions in humans, but perhaps there is a degree of complexity also in apes. And we were looking at that by examining mimicry and other replications. It's interesting to look at these exchanges that occur just on that modality level. So related to this, emotional contagion has been so much linked to laughter and smiles. Robert Provine conducted a study that showed that just when we hear laughter, that induces something positive in us and induces laughter in us. And these expressions are clearly so very important for social bonding, helping to establish them, helping to maintain them, helping to promote them further. So it's mimicry and other expressions from that angle very much of interest to us. And I actually stumbled into that topic when I first observed two orangutans that were not all that playful. When they were playing with one another, they were showing these open mouth expressions and also laughter. They were producing them constantly. I have not seen them interact this way with other orangutans. This happened in Sepilok Orangutan Rehabilitation Center, where I collected data for my PhD study. And we noticed also that they were showing these expressions, these facial expressions, particularly more when they were observed by the other, and they seemed to replicate these expressions rapidly. And of course, we then systematically tested for this and found this to be the case, that they produced rapid facial mimicry, so that they replicated or they matched these open mouth faces within 1 second. And there are nowadays also other studies that show rapid facial mimicry. It's actually not so unusual to see that across mammals. We know that from primates, different primates. We know that about carnivores. Rapid facial mimicry seems to be something very deeply rooted in mammalian play. And nowadays we look more at exact matching, and we look for subtle, whether these subtle differences in the facial expressions induce an exact the exact same variant. This is relevant in human social interactions, where Duchenne smile can induce a Duchenne smile, a non-Duchenne smile can induce a non-Duchenne smile. And we studied this in sun bears, found it to be the case. Elisabetta Palagi also examined this in gorillas and found it to be the case as well, but not in chimpanzees, which made us wonder. It is one explanation could be that it was not in that group. Perhaps there are differences across groups. That group that was studied was from a zoo, so maybe yeah, there can be many different explanations for why this didn't happen. We were surprised because we saw that also in sun bears, so we examined this more closely. And this is a study that is conducted by Diane Austri, where we look at open mouth faces where the upper teeth are exposed and not exposed in orangutans and chimpanzees, and looked at 30 orangutans, 47 chimpanzees, and over 2,000 open mouth faces with and without upper tooth exposure. And first conducted our traditional approach, or the traditional approach, by using a McNamara test and testing for replications in general of these expressions, and found these orangutans and chimpanzees to replicate these expressions. And then we tested for exact matching, and found that the orangutans did that for both variants. So when the playmate was showing the upper tooth exposure, the subjects were following this expression with also an upper tooth exposure, and the other way around it was for the no upper tooth exposure. And we also found that the more matching was involved, the longer the play bouts. There was a correlation there. We found that for the orangutans. However, for the chimpanzees, we did not find such a relationship, although we also found evidence for exact matching. So therefore, we argue that at least for the orangutans, this exact matching seems to be playing a role in their social bonding strategies, as play is so important for social cohesion. We also looked, that's a few years back, at replications linked to laughter, and found evidence that chimpanzees may replicate laughter, and not just in rapidly, but also in a delayed way. And that there was a distinction in the acoustic form between these responses in comparison to spontaneous laughter. Interestingly, we also found differences across the colonies in how the spontaneous laughter was used in relation to the laugh replications. So this raises questions about potential group differences, and to what extent then variants of vocal and facial laughter are used in distinctive ways, and how relevant they are for social interactions. So we were then also interested in how these expressions are used, what these expressions can trigger when one is not involved, like as a third party member. the way these expressions have an impact on us, similar to the Provine research. And this brings us to positive emotional contagion, where we lean on the definition that it occurs when an individual, in our case, we call this the subject, adopts a positive emotional state induced by another individual's comparable state. Important to consider when examining non-human species, it's important to consider testing for it in similar way as it was done with humans by considering situations where the participants are socially detached and in a different emotional state. There is research out there already on non-primates regarding this. The New Zealand parrot is showing more play vocalizations and play behaviors as a result of hearing these vocalizations, these play vocalizations, and there are similar evidence regarding pigs and dogs. And so we were interested in looking at that in apes. That previously there have not been strong indications on that for chimpanzee laughter. Bernson and Boyson examined this in young chimpanzees and found no indication that they would reproduce laughter after hearing it. We also found no evidence for that when conducting an experiment with chimpanzees at Emory by using a robot and a playback experiment. So we wanted to look at this topic by using more of a natural approach. And this is a study that is conducted with Guy Desakesh and Kim Bard. And here we tested for 30 orangutans and here we examined 30 orangutans and 44 chimpanzees. We selected play scenes similar to how we did that for the mimicry studies. And it was important to have individuals play with one another in these play scenes, and a third party member that was socially uninvolved, that would be then the subject, and in a neutral state. And we looked at various behaviors, play actions, laughter, and open mouth faces. And we used a matching scene that did not involve play, but had everything else similar in its scene. And we found that 4 times more often there were play actions shown by the third party member in the play scenes than in the non-play scenes. And we then tested specifically for such play contagion by examining congruent behaviors versus non-congruent behaviors, and by combining the play scenes with the non-play scenes. And we found that the chimpanzees, both the chimpanzees and the orangutans, showed significantly more congruent behaviors than non-congruent behaviors. So that we concluded for play contagion, the subjects were affected by play of their conspecifics, even though they were not involved before, and seemed to be in a neutral state. So then it was important to consider whether these were merely motoric behaviors. We found less likely, particularly since the subjects did not show solitary play. If it would have been solitary play, they could have just stayed in where they were and just shown these behaviors, like playful hand movements, for instance, where they were. They also directed their play actions mostly to the playing conspecifics, not to non-playing conspecifics. So these were indicators for us that the mere motoric explanation is unlikely. Also, it could be that there was no motivation involved. We looked at that more closely and found that 71% of the play scenes, the subjects actually made the effort and got up and walked towards the playing conspecifics. So we found that also unlikely. We found that there must have been some motivation involved. So that we concluded for positive emotional contagion in apes, and replicating these positive behaviors, playful behaviors that are so relevant for one's development and social cohesion is clearly something of benefit for apes, we argue. Yeah, what was interesting here was that we didn't find any indication that laughter was produced by the subjects. Once they started playing, or well, shortly once they started playing, or before that, perhaps it makes sense for us to look at the whole play scene of the subjects, and that's something we are looking into. But it's not that just observing play quickly induces laughter. There was no evidence for that. So we have, there is no indication that there is laugh contagion. Perhaps this can be explained by the acoustic properties. I mentioned before that human laughter has acoustic traits that are perceived as particularly positive, and these traits are less present in apes. Perhaps that explains it. It could also be that there is the need for the third-party members actually not to be third-party members, to be involved, and perhaps that is an important difference between ape laughter and human laughter, that we can sit and watch something, observe something, and enjoy that, whereas the apes might have to be more involved. And this also reminds me of how we use laughter in different contexts, and how we have this control of laughter, where we have vocal functional flexibility, and this is less the case. There is much less evidence for that in great apes. However, apes have some flexibility regarding these expressions. I found this to be the case, particularly for the open mouth faces. However, it's very rare that they occur completely outside of play. Here's a short video clip of the juvenile Pia from Serengeti Park, Copenhagen, who was teasing her father, pulling at his hair, and then he would not budge. He would not want to play with her. So she left the scene, sat somewhere else, and then seemed to relax, and all of a sudden showed these open mouth faces. So for me, that video is very special because it doesn't show any apparent play, or even it doesn't show even any sign of solitary play, other than this expression was shown. So laughter and laugh faces of apes show some degree of flexibility, but it's quite limited. They are replicated in various ways, including exact ones, and they seem to require more of an involvement in contrast to humans. So there are some degree of flexibility, there's some degree of complexity, and we were then interested in looking further at the specific form of these expressions and how they relate to the social environment. So this is a study that is led by Fabio Crepaldi, one of my PhD students, who looked at the relationship between friendship and open mouth faces. And in humans, of course, smiles and laughter, they are considered social glue, the social glue in humans, they influence very much social relationships and seem to be influenced by social relationships. And there's also evidence that there are differences in facial muscle activities with dependence on whether one is with a friend there or not. And there seems to be potential for that also in apes. If we look at the literature, our study on the orangutan facial expressions showed that the facial constellation changes when the social partner is watching the orangutans in play as opposed to not watching. And there are also other studies showing difference and occurrence of these play expressions in chimpanzees when the mother is of the younger playmate is nearby. And there is also evidence that these open mouth faces can be produced more flexibly, independent of laughter. So we looked at this more closely and predicted that the number of action units might increase in orangutans, and we're also looking at that in chimpanzees now, might increase with social closeness. And we studied hereby the orangutans from Sepilok Orangutan Rehabilitation Center because they live in peer groups and they live in a very natural setting. Here is the video clip showing these orangutans.
Nah, mau hujan sudah. Sepilok. Look like rain.
So very playful. I hope this video was not too loud, too much of a surprise. It was quite loud just now. Hope it was not at your end. So yeah, these are very playful orangutans. Sorry. And so we looked at them more closely, studied 17 orangutans, and 300 open mouth faces were coded with orang facts. And we also looked at social proximity and used a social network analysis. And the GLMM results showed that the number of action units in open mouth faces increased actually with social closeness. And the number of action units is for us a sign of complexity. So that with social closeness, these open mouth faces became more and more complex. We also found indication that subject age and play intensity that open mouth, the action units changed with regard to subject age and play intensity, but we found that this didn't have an impact on, these were no confounding variables regarding the former mentioned results. So therefore, we concluded that orangutan laugh faces become more complex, or at least may become more complex with closer social relationships, so that these expressions can be indicators of strong social bonds among their partners. And this leads to questions about social learning and to what extent can facial expressions be affected by the social environment. And we are also looking at the use of orangutans, the subtle changes in orangutan, the subtle changes in open mouth faces of chimpanzees across 3 chimpanzee groups from Chimfunji Wildlife Orphanage. And this is a study led by Mackenzie Hughes, who was my master students a few years back, and this is also conducted in collaboration with Britt Flokiewicz and Zana Clay and Bridget Waller. We know from humans, that there are cultural differences in the facial expressions, and that can be the case of smiles, that there are certain action units that may differ, including the upper cheek raiser, the action units responsible for the pulling the lip corners further back and extending the mouth, moving the jaw further, so that they can be they can differ across cultures. And we looked at this in the literature regarding the potential of this in apes. And again, same evidence as I mentioned before in the project with friendship on friendship, we found, yeah, there is some, seems to be some impact coming from the social environment, so that we examined this topic more closely. We compared 3 comparable groups of chimpanzees living all in the same Miombo forest in enclosures there, so that if we found differences, ecological explanations would be less likely. Also genetically, these 3 groups are comparable, and we used then data from 2 field studies and used chimp facts for almost 500 open mouth faces of 83 subjects, and found 31 facial constellations, and half of them, or 15 of them, were present in just 1 out of the 3 groups. So there's already here some indication that these groups, these facial constellations may differ across the groups. And the GLM results supported that. Particularly differences were found in relation to group 4, which is a very harmonic group, as research from Katie Cronin and Ed van Leuven has shown. So we found in this study that group 4 showed more AUs and they were more frequently present. And they showed more frequently present AU27s, which is the jaw stretch, as opposed to just the jaw drop, in comparison to group 2. And this difference is suggesting that there is a difference on a group level, can be a difference in the group level in chimpanzees with regard to complexity and intensity of the expression, and that chimpanzees' open mouth faces may differ across groups. So is that a result of social learning? It's certainly something that needs to be discussed more closely. And but if it's the case, then how would that work? I think the exact replications that I mentioned before of these open mouth faces could be an interesting explanation here. Very quickly replicating the exact forms of open mouth faces, could certainly be a way in which one would learn about facial expressions from others. But of course, there are also other explanations based on this, because this study was conducted in chimpanzee. The explanations, we would argue, are more socially based, so perhaps a reflection of the social constellation. And that would certainly work with our findings that in the study led by Fabio Crepaldi, where he found the complexity to increase with social closeness. So this is certainly something we find important to look further at. And they are supporting this idea that ape expressions are open mouth faces, and lab vocalizations are more complex than just being mere outbursts. So we argue in our complexity and continuity hypothesis of laughter and smiles that, first of all, laughter and smiles, smiles of positive affect, evolved from play, from pre-existing traits. that ancestral ape laughter and laugh faces were already complex back then, not just in form, but also in function, that they most likely were important for social cohesion. And also we would argue, and this was not addressed in previously, that perhaps these expressions go beyond just being expressions of play. Perhaps the open mouth faces that are seen outside of play, like the silent bare teeth displays, which look so very similar, perhaps that is already a product of an emancipation across contexts, where Van Hove argued that this emancipation happened only within the human lineage. So maybe that is an explanation that could tie together our findings with the discussion from Van Hove. And we also are arguing that there were gradual changes in form and function closer towards humans. There were important changes where laughter and laugh faces are perceived as more positive, playing such an important role in human social communication. And they became more and more pervasive tools, becoming more frequent, occurring in all kinds of contexts, having more control and being very closely linked to humor. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this was not too fast. I wanted to put in a lot of information, so I hope that was not too much and too much explained in, and not that I didn't go in too much into depth. Maybe the discussion will help there. Thanks very much for listening to this, and I also want to thank my collaborators and our the funding agencies and the sanctuaries and in zoos where we were able to collect such data. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, great. We're going to take some questions. So we'll give a minute for people to use the raise hand function if you're on Zoom, and people have questions in the room. Just raise your hands here too. Okay, Sasha?
Thanks. Thanks, Marina. It was a really great talk. And there's so many studies. I like having a hard time deciding which questions I want to ask, because I want to ask a lot. Yeah, I was interested in, well, one of the studies you were talking about, the third-party observers who then engaged in play. And I was wondering how you found like a match, like sort of methodological question is more like, how did you find a matched scene for that? And then I was also wondering if you could expand more about how I think you were saying something about like, it's not merely like motoric contagion, but maybe something like social context seems to matter more. And I was just wondering if you could expand more on that, like the implications of that. Those two questions.
All right. So I couldn't hear so well. I think there's based on the acoustics. So I just wanted to check. So the first question was about the play scenes and the matching scenes, how these non-play scenes were selected.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Oh, all right. So less about how the play scenes were selected.
Well, yeah, both, I guess.
Okay. So for us, it was quite challenging to find these scenes, and we had undergraduate students searching for these scenes who were unfamiliar with what we wanted to do with them, and so we needed a scene where there were two individuals playing and a third party member who was not interacting with them and in a neutral state. And And then, of course, we were coding for play actions, laughter, and open mouth faces. And sometimes these scenes, these videos were, so whatever scenes when an undergraduate student found then such a scene, we looked at how long these scenes were. Let's say they lasted for a minute. Then the objective was to find another scene with the same 3 individuals. That also lasted for 1 minute, where they were, for instance, grooming the conspecifics were playing before. And the third party member was also nearby and not interacting. Yeah, that was the prerequisite. So we were finding a scene that matched not only in the social constellation, but also in the duration. And then we used an approach that was very similar to, I didn't show it here, but very similar to, well, maybe I did show it here. It's how we tested for mimicry in our research previously, where we combined these 2 scenes in order to make a conclusion for congruent behaviors. And we wanted to see whether in the play scene whether there was a play action shown by the third party member, or and whether the third party member was showing no play action in the non-play scene. So if that would be the case in these two scenes, we would consider this to be congruent behavior. But it could also be that the third party member was showing a play action in both scenes, or a play action in none of these scenes. And of course, the fourth possibility is to flip it around. The third party member could show no play action in the play scene and a play action in the non-play scene, right? So we use then a McNamara test in order to test for these 4 options, where I showed here just the congruent behaviors in comparison to the non-congruent behaviors. Yeah, but it's basically the same approach that we used for testing for mimicry. Mm-hmm. And
cool.
Repeat your second question.
Yeah, so the second question is asking more about your interpretations of like, I guess, sort of the mechanisms of contagion, emotional contagion. And you're arguing that the evidence of play contagion was suggested it's not just like a motoric contagion, I think is the word you used. And I was wondering, like, what is the alternative that you're proposing? Is it that there's something about the social context, or what exactly the mechanism is?
So it's motoric in the sense that there is no. So we argue it is something more emotionally based rather than merely motoric. So where one could, for instance, just copy a behavior in a more reflex-wise, automatic way, without emotions being induced. And we would argue that if the third-party members are, so if they are just observing the play, and it's because they the playing chimpanzees are if it's not linked to emotions, then the third party member could just be sitting there. There is no reason for the third party member to want to be involved, to want to make the effort to approach the other individual. So we found that even though play is something positive, we found it important to still point out that with these additional observations that it's more emotion based. I'm just curious what your thoughts are you thinking more along the lines that these play the play contagion may not be emotionally linked, or are you thinking, yeah, just curious what your thoughts are. Sorry to give that back to you.
Yeah, I mean, no, I agree. I maybe confused more about like the wording than anything, but yeah, I would also like guess that there's an emotional contagion underlying it. That's sort of like what I'm trying to test in my dissertation research, but right, like who knows? It's not a lot, there's not a lot of evidence either way, but I think this is a great piece of evidence. Yeah, so thanks so much. I want to make sure other people can ask their questions too.
All right, thanks.
Okay, I think Dan is up next.
Well, I have a number of questions or comments. Really interesting talk. I'll just introduce one, and because I'm eager to hear Erica's thoughts, and then if there's time, I'll perhaps circle back to the others. So on this topic that you were just discussing with Sasha in terms of emotional contagion and motivation, I think, it's extremely plausible that that's what's going on. But if one puts on one's skeptic's hat, there is another explanation, which is that the same circumstances, events, evoke the same emotions in multiple individuals without there being any contagion per se, right? So let me provide you with, and again, I think you're right. I'm just looking at it through the eyes of a skeptical reviewer, right? So imagine that individuals were engaging in sexual behavior and a third-party observer evinced, sexual arousal and approached those individuals as a mating opportunity, okay? One way of explaining that would be, well, they witnessed other individuals' sexual arousal and they experienced sexual arousal because of that. But another way of explaining it would be, no, there's just a mating opportunity there. If those individuals were feeding, there'd be a feeding opportunity. We wouldn't say that the hunger was contagious. We just say there's an opportunity afforded by the social context. So yeah, they approach because there's play going on. There's an opportunity to play. They're motivated to play, but they aren't experiencing emotional contagion.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Would you say they would therefore go more to the playing conspecifics than the non-playing conspecifics? I guess you would say that as well. Yeah.
I mean, again, this is looking at the phenomenon through the eyes of an extreme skeptic. I find it very, very plausible that the emotional experiences of the animals is very similar to humans and that contagion is occurring. But exactly the same behavior can be explained without there being any emotional contagion. It's just the affordances of the social behavior of the conspecifics. Play is fun. There's play going on. I want to be involved in play, so I approach the playful individuals. I experience the same emotions they're experiencing, but not because of contagion, just because of the circumstance. Right?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I just wonder how would one be able to distinguish between these two?
I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a challenge. But as I said, I'm eager to hear Erica's thoughts, so I'm gonna shut up now.
Thank you for this comment. Very interesting. Thank you.
Erica?
Hi, Marina. Thanks so much. Really interesting talk. Thanks, Dan. I'm not sure I have like a great answer to your question, but I appreciate the tip of the hat. I assume that Dan is leaning more towards, an experimentally controlled presentation where you would have the observer in a different context, which I think you raised, Marina, in your talk as one way of demonstrating that there would be that kind of contagion, is if you have them in a different social context, say, watching a video or, having them in doing more of a playback. But then of course becomes very difficult, especially if we're thinking about emotion, to try to elicit those kinds of feelings in a rather sterile and removed laboratory situation. So anyway, I will just get on with my question, which was, I wanted to ask, I guess it's sort of related. I wanted to ask about solitary play and about facial expressions, maybe not laughter, because I don't think there's any evidence that it occurs in solitary play, unless I misheard. But silent or play faces do occur sometimes in solitary play. So I wanted to ask your opinion a little bit about, what is the function of play signals during solitary play? Do you see them? Something I'm really interested in is the kind of, we'll say, simple intentionality, right? You're sort of choosing to signal or producing a signal directed towards another individual or directed towards the groups of individuals. But I'm very interested in this longstanding debate about gesture versus facial expression, and gesture as, having more evidence, at least in early studies, of it being sort of deployed, whereas facial expression, again, in early studies, is seeming to be a little bit more of an honest signal of an underlying affective state. So I was wondering, a lot of the work that you were presenting today, I think, could just as easily be gesture as facial expression in terms of the social interactions and the function. And it's really, lovely studies. So I was just wondering, about solitary play, whether you see the same kinds of signals or same kinds of facial expressions. And if so, does that provide evidence that they are functioning sort of as signals, or, as more or less honest representations of emotion?
So thank you for this question. So in solitary play, and we have not examined this and compared it with expressions of social play, just how I perceive it. They don't seem, these expressions don't seem to be all that. The social play expressions seem to be more exaggerated. The upper teeth are shown, the lip corners are pulled back a little bit further. That's just my impression. But it could also be as a result of social play being just more intense, rougher. And solitary play is just, you cannot replicate this roughness in solitary play. It's not as exciting. So one could explain also why these expressions look different, and it may have nothing to do with intentionality, emotions, etc. It would be very interesting to look at that further and maybe look at social play of low intensity with solitary play of similar intensity. And regarding intentional expressions, I don't know how to say that. Just like with, I know that there are certain requirements to say that this behavior is most likely intentional, but it's not. I find it difficult to say that for every individual expression. And this expression, the other expression, is emotional. I think it's just a mix of everything, and sometimes a little bit more of one than another. Some expressions may be communicative, but some may not be even communicative. It's just an emotional outburst, and maybe that's for solitary play. I think there are lots of questions in how these expressions work, and I just think it's really difficult to disentangle all of this. But it's certainly exciting to look at intentionality in facial expressions and Yeah, the communicate. I don't think there is much of a communicative value in when they are playing on a solitary level. It's just, it could be more of a joyful thing, and similar to how children play by themselves. It's maybe just something joyful, unless they know that they're being watched. I think it's just, sorry, I'm just asking myself more and more questions. I'm not really answering yours. It's just really tricky to answer this question. Yeah, but yeah, it would be very interesting to look at these play expressions more and more deeply.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Should we come back to Dan? There's no other hands up that I can see. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Can I speak directly?
Yes, they can hear. As long as you speak loudly, I think that's
Okay. Hi, Marina. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is Akira Takada from Kyoto University. I'm now having a short visit to UCLA. Good to see you here. Okay, I have two questions. The first one, it's a kind of the clarification question. I'm particularly interested in the social learning of the laughter. And when you say about that social learning, does that mean the detail of the pattern of the laughing facial expression, or is that the context that the particular facial expression pattern is applied? That can be both.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I cannot hear you all that well.
Okay.
Just the core part of that question, perhaps. Sorry.
Okay. When you say the social learning of that laughter, does that mean the particular the development of the pattern of the facial expression, or the development of the context that particular pattern is applied?
So does here, can you hear me better?
Yeah, I can hear you better.
If I'm getting this right. So is this social learning more relevant to the pattern of the laughter, the actual
The
vocalization, or to the context of the laughter? Like laugh, if in context X, you should laugh, in context Y, you shouldn't laugh. Like which one were you thinking the social learning applied more to? I think, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it could be both. When we studied laughter, the vocalization, and looked at laugh responses and spontaneous laughter, we found that they differed across the group. They were used differently across the group, and they also were differing in form. So maybe it's both, but we don't know if it's the result just because there are group differences. We don't know if it's due to social learning, but there is the possibility there. Yeah. I could imagine it's both, but I don't have a clear. I cannot clearly comment on this. Sorry.
Yeah, mimicking could be both. So, and the second question, maybe you can again translate. The second question is in relation to the Ekman basic emotions, and there are other bunch of basic emotions, and like anger or happiness. And are there any argument about the developmental trajectory, evolutionary developmental trajectory about which facial expression come faster or later?
Did I hear correctly? So from the basic emotions, which one is more deeply rooted in evolution? Okay, thank you. So yeah, difficult to say again. So we argue that, of course, these positive expressions are deeply grounded. There's, I mean, well, it's it's likely also that the very negative expressions like crying, there are discussions about ape crying, whimpering, that is goes really deep. When we look at other nonverbal expressions, it's difficult to see clear relationships between apes and humans, but these very positive and these very negative expressions seem to have show phylogenetic continuity. Regarding laughter, there are discussions. Rats, for instance, producing laughter. I personally am very skeptical about that. Rats do not produce open mouth faces. They all obviously produce ultrasonic sounds because they including play vocalizations. So I'm not sure if these are the same expressions. Screams are clearly heard across mammals. I could imagine that these negative expressions are more deeply grounded than laughter, even than positive ones. It helps perhaps to note that non-human primates and carnivores, they can also produce more than just one type of play vocalization. So it's important to be cautious about that. But I think that's something really important to phylogenetically examine as well, these negative expressions.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that because the laughter in humans, the laughter can have some similar function to both language and music. So and it can be located somewhere in between. So when we think about the evolution of the communication, laughter could be very, very important.
Erica, your backup was your comment or question in relation to the direct line or a new thing? Because I think we've got time for sort of one more.
Yeah, it was a new thing. I'm just putting it in the chat.
Oh,
mostly
okay.
I just wanted to say I was excited about sun bears.
Yeah, sun bears are really interesting. Before we started studying sun bears, we only looked at the apes and non-human primates, and then when we started observing these bears, we just noticed that they're showing complex behaviors just beyond play. That if they were chimps, we would say something like, "Oh, this is consolation. This is that. This is these are complex behaviors," and just because they are, of course, evolutionarily so distanced from us, and because they are quite solitary, or they have strong solitary tendencies, we are just so much more careful about making conclusions. Of course, one needs to be careful, but it's just really amazing what kind of behaviors they show. And we started studying them mainly because we had the opportunity to do so, and I thought that would be nice for undergraduates to study them. They were nearby the orangutan sanctuary work, and there was not much research. There was not any research when we started on behavioral research on sun bears. So we just thought, these are great opportunities for student projects. And we were just then amazed about what these bears do, and that they show these really complex facial exchanges, and that they, even when they are, we're looking at play mostly, but when they are playing, they have a short play break, watch each other, and then show this facial exchange, and then continue play. Whereas, with as you know, with orangutans and chimpanzees, it's all over the place, and there are only brief moments where these exchanges take place. So the sun bears are really cool.
I think we're out of time, so maybe Dan, you and Marina can connect over email or something for the rest of your questions. But let's give one more round of applause to thank Marina.
Thank you very much, and for this opportunity, and also for these great questions and comments. Really, really great to hear. Thank you.
Thank